The real consequence was waking up unable to hide from yourself anymore. And in the end, perhaps that was also the beginning of redemption. Because sometimes the most valuable lesson in a person's life arrives disguised as shame. Quiet. Unexpected. Walking into a room wearing ordinary clothes. And leaving behind a truth so powerful that everyone who witnessed it is changed forever. They refused him at the counter, and had no idea who they were turning away. A quiet man walked into a luxury boutique in simple clothes, no entourage, no ego, just a calm request to see a watch. But the moment the staff looked at him, something shifted, a silent judgment, a decision made in seconds that would change everything. He was told, politely, "This piece isn't for you." He didn't argue. He didn't react. He just turned, and walked out. Minutes later, phones started ringing, one by one. Then all at once. And when they finally checked the security footage, they realized the man they just refused wasn't who they thought at all. The luxury watch boutique stood quietly on the corner of one of the wealthiest streets in the city, where polished glass towers reflected the afternoon sun like giant mirrors and every passing car seemed to whisper money. The store itself looked less like a business and more like a private world designed for people who had already proven their place among privilege. Inside, everything felt slower. The air carried the faint scent of leather, cedarwood, and polished marble. Warm golden lighting spilled gently from hidden fixtures in the ceiling, softening every edge of the room until even silence felt expensive. Glass display cases stretched across the floor in perfect symmetry, each one holding watches that looked more like pieces of art than instruments designed to tell time. Nothing in the boutique happened by accident. Every movement was measured. Every smile was practiced. Every word spoken by the staff carried the polished calm of people trained to serve wealth without ever appearing impressed by it. A man in a navy suit leaned over one display while a sales associate explained the history of a rare Swiss timepiece in a smooth professional tone. Nearby, an elegant couple examined a gold watch while quietly laughing together. Even their laughter seemed restrained, careful not to disturb the atmosphere. This was the kind of place where status entered before people did. And then the door opened. The soft chime echoed lightly through the boutique. At first, nobody reacted. But one by one, the employees slowly lifted their eyes. The man who stepped inside did not match the room. He wore a dark jacket with slightly worn edges, the kind of jacket someone keeps because it is comfortable, not because it impresses anyone. Beneath it was a simple shirt with no visible label or luxury branding. His shoes were clean but ordinary. His hair fell naturally, slightly messy, as though he had pushed his fingers through it instead of standing in front of a mirror for half an hour. He didn't look poor. But he definitely didn't look like the boutique's usual customer. A quiet shift moved through the room. It wasn't loud enough to notice unless you were paying attention. It existed in the exchanged glances between employees, in the brief pause behind the counter, in the subtle tightening of expressions. The thought spread silently. He doesn't belong here. The man, however, seemed completely unaware of it. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. He stepped fully inside and let the door close behind him. Then he paused for just a moment, calmly taking in the room. His eyes moved slowly across the displays, the lighting, the architecture. Unlike tourists who entered luxury spaces with nervous excitement, he wasn't overwhelmed. He was observing. Carefully. Almost thoughtfully. Then he began to walk. His steps were steady and unhurried. He didn't rush toward the watches with eager fascination, nor did he linger awkwardly near the entrance pretending to browse. There was something unusually calm about him. A quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but somehow held it anyway. Still, no one approached. Usually, the staff greeted customers within seconds. A smile. An offer of assistance. A polished introduction. But not this time. something held them back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe assumption. Maybe years of training that had taught them how to identify wealth at a glance. The man stopped at the first display case. Inside, rows of watches rested on soft velvet cushions beneath warm lights that made the metal glow like liquid gold. He leaned forward slightly, hands relaxed at his sides, and examined them with unusual patience. Not casually. Not greedily. Carefully. His eyes lingered on tiny details most people would never notice. The curve of a case. The texture of a dial. The movement of delicate hands beneath sapphire crystal. He looked at the watches the way an artist studies another artist's work. Across the room, a younger sales associate named Adrian quietly watched him. Something about the man felt difficult to categorize. Most customers either entered with visible confidence or obvious insecurity. Wealthy buyers often carried entitlement. Curious visitors usually carried nervousness. But this man carried neither. He simply moved through the room with complete ease. As though expensive surroundings had no power over him at all. The man continued browsing until he reached a separate display positioned near the center of the boutique. This case was different. Inside rested one watch. Just one. The lighting around it was softer, more focused, almost reverent. It was a rare piece. Elegant. Complex. Extremely expensive. But there was something deeper about it. The craftsmanship felt timeless. Every line seemed intentional. Every detail carried restraint rather than excess. The man stopped completely. For the first time since entering the store, his expression shifted ever so slightly. Not excitement. Recognition. He leaned closer, studying the watch in silence. Across the room, the manager noticed. Victor Laurent had spent years mastering the language of luxury. He understood wealthy clients instantly. He knew how to recognize old money, new money, insecurity, arrogance, status, ambition. Reading people had become part of his profession. And yet this man unsettled him. Because he did not fit the usual patterns. The longer the man stood there, the stranger the atmosphere inside the boutique became. Conversations softened. Attention drifted. Even customers began quietly noticing him. But still nobody approached. The silence stretched. Finally, after several long moments, the man stepped away from the display and walked calmly toward the counter. Adrian straightened immediately. Victor subtly shifted his attention. The room seemed to hold its breath. The man stopped at the counter and offered a small courteous smile. "Excuse me," he said gently. His voice was calm, warm, and unexpectedly soft. "May I see that watch, please?" He lightly indicated the rare timepiece behind the glass. For one brief second, Adrian almost responded automatically. "Of course, sir." That was what training demanded. Open the case. Present the watch. Explain the craftsmanship. Treat the customer with dignity. But another instinct interrupted. Adrian's eyes drifted briefly toward the jacket. The shoes. The shirt. Not poor, he thought. Just, not right. A polite smile appeared on his face. "That model is very expensive, sir," he said carefully. The words sounded professional. But the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. "You probably cannot afford it." The man's expression didn't change. He simply waited. Adrian continued too quickly, trying to smooth over the discomfort already forming in the air. "Perhaps you'd like to see something more affordable." The sentence landed softly. Yet somehow that softness made it worse. The room grew quieter. The man stood perfectly still. There was no anger in his face. No embarrassment. No outrage. Only a small flicker of disappointment that passed through his eyes so briefly most people would have missed it. Then, in the same calm voice, he said, "I'd still like to see that one." The simplicity of the response unsettled Adrian more than anger would have. Because there was no challenge in it. No ego. No attempt to prove anything. Just dignity. Adrian hesitated. And that hesitation changed everything. People nearby began openly paying attention now. The elegant couple slowed their conversation. A customer in a charcoal suit turned slightly toward the counter. Even the silence in the boutique no longer felt elegant. It felt uncomfortable. Then another voice entered the moment. "Is there a problem here?" Victor Laurent stepped forward with smooth, controlled confidence. He wore authority naturally, the way some people wear expensive cologne. Years in luxury retail had trained him to protect the atmosphere of the boutique above all else. Adrian immediately stepped back. "This gentleman is interested in the Marcel Tourbillon," he explained. Victor turned toward the man and offered a polished smile. "A remarkable piece," he said smoothly. "I know," the man replied. Victor's smile tightened almost invisibly. There was something deeply unsettling about the calmness standing in front of him. "I'd like to see it," the man added. Victor folded his hands lightly. For a brief moment, he considered the request. Then he made the decision that would change all of their lives. "I'm sorry, sir," he said politely. "That piece is reserved for serious buyers." The sentence sounded elegant. Professional. Reasonable. But everyone in the room understood what it truly meant. "You are not one of us." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. The man looked at Victor quietly. Then he nodded once. A small respectful gesture. "I understand," he said. And somehow those two words made the entire boutique feel smaller. Because he understood perfectly. Not the policy. The judgment. And without another word, he turned toward the door. Still calm. Still dignified. Still carrying more grace than anyone else in the room. The soft chime rang again as he opened the door and stepped back into the ordinary noise of the city. Traffic. Voices. Life. And inside the boutique, beneath golden lights and polished marble floors, something invisible had already begun to crack. For several long seconds after the door closed behind him, nobody inside the boutique moved. The silence remained suspended beneath the warm lighting like smoke after a fire. Victor Laurent slowly adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, trying to restore the polished rhythm of the room. Adrian lowered his eyes toward the counter, pretending to organize paperwork that did not need organizing. Somewhere in the background, soft instrumental music continued playing through hidden speakers, elegant and calm, as though nothing uncomfortable had happened. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone could feel it. The customer in the charcoal suit no longer looked interested in the watch presentation beside him. The elegant woman in the cream-colored coat glanced toward the door with quiet disapproval before returning her attention to the display case in front of her. Luxury spaces survive on illusion. On the feeling that refinement and morality are somehow connected. And for the first time that afternoon, the illusion inside the boutique had begun to crack. Victor forced a smooth smile back onto his face and turned toward a returning client. "As I was saying," he began carefully, "this particular movement is admired for its precision and..." The phone rang. The sharp sound sliced through the room. Ordinarily, the boutique's phones blended naturally into the atmosphere. Reservations, private collectors, exclusive appointments, supplier confirmations. But this ring sounded different. Sharper. More urgent. Adrian reached for the receiver immediately, grateful for something practical to focus on. "Luxury House Boutique," he said smoothly. "This is Adrian speaking. How may I assist you?" There was no greeting on the other end. Only a voice already filled with anger. "Did you just refuse service to Keanu Reeves?" Adrian froze. For one strange second, his brain could not process the sentence. Not because he hadn't heard the words. Because they sounded impossible. "I'm sorry," he said weakly. The caller's voice sharpened. "A man in a dark jacket entered your store less than an hour ago. Did your staff refuse to show him a watch because you assumed he couldn't afford it?" Across the room, Victor noticed Adrian's expression change. The color slowly drained from his face. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Adrian said. The caller let out a short laugh. "That tells me everything I need to know." The line disconnected. Adrian remained frozen with the receiver in his hand. Victor approached slowly. "What was that?" Adrian swallowed. "Someone asked if we refused service to Keanu Reeves." The room went silent. Not elegant silence. Not controlled silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives when reality suddenly enters a room full of performance. Victor gave a short dismissive laugh. "That's ridiculous," he said too quickly. But before anyone could respond, another phone began ringing. This time from Victor's office. Then another line lit up at the register. Leela answered carefully. "Luxury House Boutique. How may I help you?" A man's voice immediately exploded through the receiver. "Is it true your staff humiliated Keanu Reeves because he didn't dress rich enough for your store?" Leela's stomach tightened. Across the room, the customer in the charcoal suit slowly turned fully toward them now, openly listening. "Sir," Leela began carefully, "we are currently reviewing." "I've purchased from your boutique for 6 years, the caller interrupted. "If that story is true, I'm done with you people." The line went dead. A cold heaviness spread through the boutique. Victor no longer looked calm. The confidence that usually lived so naturally on his face had started slipping away. Then another phone rang. And another. Within minutes, every line inside the boutique was active. The atmosphere collapsed into controlled panic. A woman demanded the full names of every employee working that afternoon. Another caller claimed journalists were already asking questions online. One private client threatened to cancel a 6-figure purchase. Another simply said, "People are not accessories." Then disconnected. The boutique began losing its shape under the pressure. Staff crossed paths too quickly. Voices overlapped. The polished calm of the room started cracking in visible ways. A drawer slammed harder than intended. A watch tray was set down too sharply in the back room. Adrian took notes he could barely read because his hands had started trembling. And still the phones kept ringing. Victor moved rapidly between desks trying to restore order. "Answer everything," he instructed. "Take names. Stay professional." But professionalism no longer mattered. The story had already escaped the boutique. And outside those walls, people weren't hearing polished explanations. They were hearing something simpler. A quiet man entered a luxury store. He was judged by his clothes. He was refused respect. And that man happened to be Keanu Reeves. The emotional truth of the story spread faster than facts ever could. Leela suddenly looked toward Victor. "The cameras," she said quietly. Victor frowned. "What?" "The security footage." For a second nobody moved. Then Victor turned sharply toward the monitor room. Adrian followed immediately. Leela came behind them. The security screen flickered softly as Victor loaded the entrance footage. There it was. The door opening. The man stepping inside. Dark jacket. Calm posture. Simple clothes. Even through grainy surveillance footage, something about him felt unmistakable now. Victor switched to another camera angle. This one showing the sales floor. They watched him move from display to display. Watched him study the watches with patient attention. Watched him stop in front of the rare timepiece. Then came the moment at the counter. Adrian watched himself hesitate. Watched Victor step forward. Watched the refusal happen in complete silence. Finally they saw the man nod politely, and walk away. The footage ended. Nobody spoke. The truth stood there on the frozen screen, undeniable. It was him, Adrian whispered. Victor stared at the monitor. For the first time all day, he truly saw what the cameras had captured. Not a confused tourist. Not an opportunist. Not someone pretending to belong. Just a calm human being asking respectfully to see something beautiful. And suddenly Victor understood how cruel the scene looked from the outside. The boutique had mistaken simplicity for insignificance. The realization hit him with terrifying force. Phones began ringing again behind them. This time nobody wanted to answer. When they returned to the sales floor, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The boutique no longer felt luxurious. It felt exposed. One of the younger associates stood pale beside the register holding his phone. "There's already something online," he said nervously. Victor looked up sharply. "What?" The associate swallowed. "A post about Keanu Reeves being turned away from a luxury watch store because he looked too ordinary." He handed Victor the phone. The post itself was short. But the comments beneath it were exploding. People shared their own stories of being ignored in expensive stores. Workers described being treated like intruders because of dusty boots. Women wrote about sales staff suddenly changing behavior after learning their husbands were wealthy. Others simply expressed disappointment. Not because a celebrity had been insulted. Because everyone recognized the deeper truth underneath it. Luxury often mistakes appearance for value. Victor stared at the screen feeling something cold settle into his chest. The boutique had become a symbol. And symbols spread fast. Regional headquarters called within the hour. Then corporate communications. Then private investors. Then journalists. The phones transformed into alarms. Every ring carried accusation. Every conversation forced them to relive the moment. A client who had purchased anniversary watches for years spoke quietly to Leela over the phone. "My father worked construction his entire life," he said. "He wore work boots into every store he entered. Do you know how many places treated him like he was invisible?" Leela closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But the apology sounded painfully small. Because some damage cannot be softened once people recognize themselves inside it. Meanwhile, outside the boutique, the city continued peacefully. Keanu Reeves walked slowly through evening crowds with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Traffic lights changed. People laughed outside cafes. A street musician played soft saxophone melodies beneath fading sunlight. And unlike the panic unfolding behind him, Keanu carried no visible anger. At a crosswalk, a young mother nearly dropped a paper grocery bag while trying to steady her stroller. An apple rolled across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Keanu bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to her with a small smile. "You're good," he said gently. The woman laughed breathlessly. "Thank you." "No problem." Then he continued walking. The contrast between him and the boutique could not have been sharper. Inside the store, expensive people panicked over reputation. Outside, the man they had judged continued moving through the city with effortless kindness. Back inside, Victor finally retreated into his office. The phone still rang through the walls. He sat heavily at his desk and opened a blank report requested by corporate headquarters. For several long moments, he simply stared at the blinking cursor. Every sentence he attempted sounded dishonest. A misunderstanding involving client expectations. Delete. An unfortunate communication issue. Delete. Nothing polished enough could hide the truth anymore. Finally, he typed slowly. This afternoon, a visitor entered the boutique wearing simple clothing and requested to view one of our most exclusive pieces. Based on appearance and assumptions, the request was denied. Victor stopped typing. The sentence looked brutal in its simplicity. Because stripped of luxury language and professional tone, cruelty always does. Outside his office, the boutique continued unraveling. The lights still glowed warmly. The marble floors still reflected gold. The watches still rested elegantly beneath glass. But none of it looked impressive anymore. Because once people witness the absence of humanity beneath luxury, the beauty starts feeling hollow. And somewhere out in the city, the quiet man they had underestimated kept walking forward untouched by the chaos behind him. While inside the boutique, everyone else was beginning to drown beneath the weight of what they had revealed about themselves. By the time evening settled over the city, Luxury House Boutique no longer felt like the untouchable sanctuary it had been that morning. The golden lights still glowed softly across the marble floor. The watches still rested beneath crystal glass like sacred objects. The scent of leather and polished wood still lingered in the air. But something invisible had changed. The room no longer felt elegant. It felt guilty. Phones continued ringing in relentless waves. Every few seconds another line lit up. Corporate representatives. Private clients. Collectors. Journalists. People who had never even entered the boutique but recognized the story instantly because they had lived versions of it themselves. Adrian stood behind the counter answering calls with a voice that sounded less steady each time. Luxury House Boutique, yes, we are currently reviewing the matter internally. The words had already become automatic. Meaningless. Because nobody calling wanted polished language anymore. They wanted honesty. And honesty was the one thing the boutique had avoided from the very beginning. Leela sat at the register writing down names and complaints while trying to hide the trembling in her hands. A long-time customer had just told her quietly. I used to think your store represented sophistication. Now I'm wondering if it only represents ego. That sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. Across the showroom, Victor moved from phone to phone like a man trying to stop water from flooding through cracks in a collapsing wall. But the damage had already escaped containment. The internet was moving faster than the boutique could think. Posts about the incident were spreading across social media. News blogs had begun picking up the story. People were debating class, wealth, image, and the cruelty hidden beneath luxury culture. And at the center of all of it stood one painfully simple image. Keanu Reeves. Standing calmly at a counter. Asking politely to see a watch. Being denied because he didn't look like the right kind of customer. The emotional power of that image became impossible to stop. Because people already loved Keanu Reeves for the exact opposite reason luxury culture existed. He was known for simplicity. For humility. For kindness. The world had spent years watching him ride subways, help strangers, sit quietly in parks eating sandwiches alone without demanding attention. And now a luxury boutique had publicly revealed how quickly society punishes people who refuse to perform wealth loudly enough. The irony was devastating. Victor finally returned to his office and closed the door harder than intended. For the first time in years, the room did not comfort him. Usually his office felt like control. Now it felt like isolation. His phone buzzed endlessly beside the keyboard. Corporate messages. Regional management. Requests for statements. Warnings about reputational fallout. One message from headquarters read: We need complete transparency before media inquiries escalate further. Victor stared at the sentence. Transparency. The word itself felt almost mocking. Because luxury culture survives on selective visibility. People see the polished floors, the elegance, the exclusivity. But they rarely see the judgments operating underneath. Tonight those judgments had become visible. And once people see something clearly, it becomes impossible to return to innocence. Victor leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Then, for reasons he could not fully explain, he opened his laptop and searched for Keanu Reeves' interviews. At first he told himself it was research. An attempt to understand the scale of the situation. But deep down, something else was happening. He needed to understand the man he had dismissed. Video after video appeared on the screen. Keanu laughing softly during interviews. Keanu helping film crew members move equipment. Keanu sitting quietly beside ordinary people without any need to remind them who he was. There was no arrogance. No performance. No hunger for superiority. And the more Victor watched, the more unbearable the memory of the boutique became. Because he realized something horrifying. Keanu had entered the store carrying more humanity than everyone working inside it combined. Victor closed the laptop slowly. For the first time in many years, shame settled inside him without resistance. Not professional embarrassment. Not fear of consequences. Real shame. The kind that forces a person to look at themselves honestly. Outside his office, the atmosphere continued deteriorating. One junior associate accidentally dropped a tray while carrying several watch straps. The sharp sound echoed across the boutique like breaking glass. Everyone jumped. Nobody said anything. The tension had reached the point where even small noises felt violent. Leela glanced toward the entrance. The city beyond the windows had softened into evening now. Streetlights reflected across the glass. People walked by carrying shopping bags, talking on phones, laughing with friends. Ordinary life moved peacefully outside. Inside the boutique, however, panic had become suffocating. Adrian suddenly lowered the receiver from another phone call and looked physically sick. What happened? Leela asked quietly. He swallowed. A journalist wants to know if management intentionally profiles customers based on appearance. Leela closed her eyes briefly. Because the terrible part was, the question no longer sounded unfair. That was exactly what had happened. The boutique simply had more elegant language for it. Around closing time, one final customer entered the store. An elderly man wearing a dark wool coat. His name was Bernard. One of the boutique's oldest collectors. He had purchased watches there for decades. Victor personally stepped out of his office to greet him. Normally Bernard's visits brought comfort. Tonight they brought dread. The older man looked around the room quietly before speaking. I heard what happened. Victor nodded once. We are handling the matter internally. Bernard studied him for several seconds. Then he said something Victor would remember for the rest of his life. Luxury means nothing without grace. The sentence landed softly. But it cut deeper than any angry phone call. Anyone can polish marble floors, Bernard continued. Anyone can dim the lights and serve champagne. But real class is revealed by how you treat people who offer you no advantage. Victor lowered his eyes. For once, he had absolutely no defense. Bernard looked toward the display where Keanu had stood earlier. Then back at Victor. I'm very disappointed in all of you. And with that, he turned and walked out. The door closed softly behind him. The boutique felt emptier afterward. Not physically. Morally. By the time the final calls slowed near closing, exhaustion hung over everyone like fog. No physical work had been done all day. And yet the staff looked drained beyond measure. Adrian sat heavily behind the counter staring blankly at the polished glass display in front of him. His own reflection looked unfamiliar. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. "That model is very expensive, sir." The sentence sounded uglier each time he remembered it. Because now he understood what had truly happened. No policy forced him to say those words. No training manual demanded cruelty. He had simply chosen assumption over humanity. And the ease with which he had done it terrified him. Leela stood near the entrance looking out at the evening traffic. She felt guilty too. Not because she made the refusal, but because she saw it forming before it happened. She had noticed the glances, the hesitation, the quiet shift in energy the moment Keanu walked inside. And still she said nothing. Fear had kept her silent. Now that silence felt heavy inside her chest. Victor eventually stepped back onto the sales floor. The confidence that once defined him seemed stripped away. He looked older somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. "We're closed tomorrow," he said quietly. Adrian looked up. "What?" "Corporate decision. Internal review and staff retraining." Leela gave a small humorless laugh. "Training?" Victor met her eyes. To his credit, he did not defend the word. "No," he admitted softly. "This goes deeper than training." Nobody answered. Because everybody understood he was right. The boutique had not suffered a public relations mistake. It had suffered a moral failure. That night, each employee carried the incident home differently. Adrian barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Keanu standing calmly at the counter. Not angry. Not defensive. Simply disappointed. And somehow that disappointment hurt worse than outrage ever could. He tried imagining himself in Keanu's position. Walking into a store. Asking politely to see something beautiful. Only to have strangers quietly decide he wasn't worthy enough to touch it. The thought made him physically ill. Meanwhile, Leela sat on the edge of her bed scrolling endlessly through comments online. People from all over the world were sharing stories now. A mechanic ignored inside a luxury dealership. A woman mistaken for housekeeping staff at a hotel because she wore simple clothes. A father treated coldly at a private school until administrators discovered he owned the building company that funded half the campus. Story after story. Different places. Same humiliation. Leela slowly realized something painful. What happened at the boutique wasn't rare. That was why people reacted so strongly. The store had simply exposed a cruelty society already understood too well. And somewhere across the city, far away from all the panic and corporate damage control, Keanu Reeves sat alone at a small cafe drinking coffee while a saxophone player performed soft melodies nearby. No anger. No bitterness. No social media posts demanding accountability. He simply existed peacefully. The same way he had before entering the boutique. The same way he would after. That contrast haunted everyone involved. Because the one person who had every right to rage seemed to carry the least hatred of anyone in the entire story. By midnight, Victor finally sat alone in his apartment staring out at the city skyline. His untouched dinner rested cold beside him. For years he had believed sophistication meant recognizing value quickly. But tonight he understood something devastating. He had spent his entire career confusing appearance with worth. And one quiet man in a worn jacket had exposed that failure in less than 5 minutes. The city lights reflected across the windows while silence filled the room. And for the first time in a very long time, Victor Laurent no longer felt powerful. Morning arrived without peace. The city outside luxury house boutique moved with its usual rhythm. Traffic flowing beneath pale sunlight, pedestrians balancing coffee cups and hurried conversations, storefronts opening one by one as though the previous day had never happened. But inside the boutique, nothing felt normal anymore. The doors remained locked. The polished marble floors reflected low muted light instead of the warm golden glow usually designed to welcome wealthy clients.